Welcome to Science Fiction, English 2420 OL 74 for the Spring 2021 semester. I'm Professor Ellis and I'll be leading our class. Now, for our first lecture in week 1, there's a number of things that we need to cover today. We need to talk about note-taking and why it's going to be important for the class. I'll make some introductions of myself to you so you kind of know what my background is and where I'm coming from in terms of teaching science fiction. Then the bulk of the class will be reviewing the syllabus so that you know everything about what's required of you, what we're going to be doing this semester, and also how to contact me, our office hours, all that kind of stuff. And then in the last phase of class, we'll talk a little bit about what is science fiction and why should we study it. And then finally, we'll discuss this week's homework, which you will have until next week to get accomplished. So first off, discuss note-taking. As we'll see when we turn to the syllabus in a little while, note-taking and your notebooks are a considerable portion of your grade in the class. And I do this for a number of reasons. First off, I know from personal experience, and this is also supported by research, that taking notes by hand, and I'm not talking about like typing up your notes on a computer, but actually handwriting your notes will improve your memory and recall of the information that you're studying. And so with that in mind, I wanted to build note-taking into the class, not only as a way to help you remember the material, the content of our class, but also hopefully to build in some good note-taking and study strategies that may help you in some of your other classes, and also once you leave City Tech and you're in the workplace. Because even though you won't necessarily be in an academic setting anymore when you're in the workplace, but note-taking itself is actually very beneficial, I've found, when I worked in private industry before I returned to academia. So with that in mind, I want to show you my favorite method of note-taking. And this is called the Cornell note-taking system. And this was developed at Cornell. And the way this works is it gives you a framework for the way that you take your notes, and it makes note-taking a much more active and engaging process. So as you can see here on the screen right now is a sample of what one sheet of paper would look like in the Cornell method, and is divided into these 3 sections. So first off, over here on the left, maybe the left 1/4 of the page, you draw a line down most of the page. And this is called the Q column. And so right now, if you haven't already done so, please get out your notebook or grab a sheet of paper and do this, because I want you to be taking notes either this way, if you don't already have an established pattern for taking notes on your own, or if you already have a good way of making notes that you're comfortable with, you may do that as well. So either way is fine, but be making some notes. So with the Cornell method, you have on the left the Q column. And this is where you put in key words, topics that are being discussed. So for example, in a moment when we start talking about the syllabus, in the Q column, you could write syllabus. And whenever I mention office hours, underneath syllabus, you could write office hours. Now, where do you put all the information that goes along with those topics? That's what this area on the right is for, the note-taking column. So directly to the right of where you've written down your Q words or your topic words, keywords, you put all the details in. So for office hours that you write as a Q word on the left, on the right, you would write down Wednesday 3 to 5 p.m. online. Whenever we talk about the assignments, you could put that assignments underneath the Q column and then list out all the different assignments and how much they're worth over on the right-hand column. But now that's only part of the Cornell system, okay? The real magic happens down here at the bottom, where you draw a horizontal line all across the bottom, and this is the summary section. And the way the Cornell system really works is, besides organizing your notes around topics and detailed notes, is that after class is over, or after you've watched one of my lectures, you want to summarize by writing 1 or 2, 3 sentences in that bottom section about what the notes on that page are about. So you basically write a short summary for the notes just on that page, because after one lecture you might have several pages of notes, and you want to summarize each of those pages of notes at the bottom of the page. Now, why is this important? Well, first off, it allows you to immediately refresh your memory about what those notes are about on that page from a given lecture. Second, that refreshing allows your mind to recall what you just heard in the lecture. It may also prime you to think about, oh, I forgot to jot something down, which you could then look up or review the lecture again and fill in some of those missing places. But third, it also helps with indexing your notes, so that when you want to review your notes, you can quickly look at the summary section and be able to, at a glance, just read those couple of sentences and you know whether that page of notes has that detailed information that you're looking for. So the idea with the Cornell system is it's much more actively engaging for the note taker than just simply just jotting a bunch of stuff down in a haphazard way without a lot of order and without any reflection taking place on the notes that you've made. So the Cornell method, I highly recommend. If you don't have an established pattern for note taking, please use this. But if you have an established pattern that you're comfortable with, you may use that as well. But the key thing is, however you make notes in my class, they need to be handwritten notes. Because as I'll detail in a minute when we talk about the syllabus, you're going to be scanning your notes and submitting them to me for both midterm and at the end of the semester. So in order to demonstrate to me that you've been actively engaged in the class, that you're following the instructions for making handwritten notes to improve your memory and recall of the information that you're note taking on. And it's also, again, meant to reinforce your learning of this material, which I think is incredibly important, and it could be something that will provide you a lot of connections that you might not otherwise make, not just now in the immediacy of our class, but once you've left our class and you move on in your other studies as well as whenever you enter your career. So note-taking is important. Please begin that when we get to the syllabus, when you want to actually remember some of the stuff that is on the syllabus. All right, so that's note-taking, and so now we can get into making introductions, then reviewing the syllabus, what is science fiction, why should we study it, and then we'll discuss homework. So before we get into the syllabus, I want you to know a little bit about me and where I'm coming from, so you know who's going to be leading this class, right? So again, I'm Professor Ellis. This picture right here is my family's home in southeast Georgia, where I'm from, in Brunswick, Georgia. It's close to St. Simon's Island and Jekyll Island. It's very, this area where my family lives is very rural, but Brunswick itself is a growing town. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center is based there. Used to be a naval base before that got moved elsewhere. But it's a port town, so a lot of things are going on there. But at the same time, it's not quite the metropolis that we live in here in New York City. Now, I've had a workplace experiences before I finished my bachelor's in science, my master's, and my PhD. I used to deliver auto parts for my family auto parts business. I worked at Gamekeepers selling chess sets and Magic the Gathering cards for Wizards of the Coast. And I've also worked IT jobs locally in Brunswick at a place called Netlink IP Communications. And then later I worked for Mindspring and Earthlink in Atlanta, Georgia. And Earthlink was based in California, and they merged with Mindspring in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So I have a broad aspect of workplace experience and also IT experience that I try to bring into some of the things that I do academically. Now, for my bachelor's degree, I went to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I started out as a physics major. And I was a physics major until I made the realization that I'm better at writing about science than doing science, which is a good thing to figure out early in one's career, not too late. But while I was at Georgia Tech, I transferred into the Bachelor of Science in Science, Technology and Culture program there. So I did all the math and science that all the other degree programs need, but I was also learning about cultural criticism and research into cultural topics such as science fiction. From Georgia Tech, I went to the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom to get my master's degree in science fiction studies, which at the time was one of the only places that you could get such a graduate degree. And if you haven't traveled abroad, once we get through this pandemic, I encourage you to do so, because I think these kinds of experiences leave an indelible impression on you. They become a part of you in a way that whenever you remain in one single place, you don't have that kind of enriching experience. You get to meet different people in places. One of the neat things about Liverpool is that the Liverpudlians, the locals there, are among some of the friendliest people I've ever met in my entire life anywhere in the world. I would get on a bus in Liverpool, and it was more often than not that I would end up in a conversation with someone on the bus about something. And sometimes it would be about science fiction. There's a lot of Michael Moorcock fans in Liverpool that I spoke with on the bus. Now, after getting my master's degree, I came back to the United States and got my PhD in English from Kent State University in Ohio. You may be familiar with Kent State from your history class and the shootings in the 1970s there during the peaceful protests against the Vietnam War by the National Guard. Tragic event in American history, but also one that resonates with the protests that we see taking place in the United States over the past several years for social justice and for lasting change, and a number of different important things that we all should strive for, I think, and is also a very core part of what science fiction is, I think, in large part today, which are some of the things that we'll talk about in the class. Now, after I got my PhD at Kent State, I went back to Georgia Tech, not for more education, but to begin teaching. You see here, this building used to be the ROTC building at Georgia Tech, and it got converted to the Writing Program Center. And I taught there for 2 years, and that was a really rewarding experience to be on the other side of the classroom with students who were much like I was back in the 1990s when I was a student at Georgia Tech. And then finally, I made my way up here to City Tech. I've been here for 6.5 years now, and it's been a tremendously rewarding experience working with students just like yourself who are interested and engaged in topics of science and technology. And of course, many of you are also interested in science fiction, which is kind of the nexus of those things as they apply to human beings and society. Now, some of my interests, I think, dovetail with my teaching of these topics, and one of those involves retro computing. This is a shelf in my office, which unfortunately we can't really go to right now because of the pandemic. But once we all get vaccinated and it's safe for us to be working together in person again, stop by my office in NAM 520 and you can take a look at some of these old computers that I have, and we can talk retro computing when we're there. Another thing that I'm involved in, again, it's something that really takes place when we can be together in person, is serious change through play. And you can see here standing up my colleague, Professor Patrick Corbett, who I worked with on this, and he continues to develop this on his own now, is using Lego as a way to help practitioners, whether they be students or professors, as you see seated here, use Lego to become better communicators, as a way of expressing yourself, as a way of thinking through problems, haptically, using our hands and our visuospatial ability to think about objects in three-dimensional space to explore the way that we can communicate and work with other people. Now, returning back to more solidly science fiction stuff, one of the things that I helped do at City Tech is manage the City Tech Science Fiction Collection. This was a large donation of science fiction magazines, novels, anthologies, and journals that amount to 600 feet of linear space. If you imagine like a shelf of books, it's 600 feet long. That's how many books and magazines we got from this anonymous donation, a very generous donation from someone in California who said we could have it if we could move it. And thankfully, the City Tech Foundation and the administration believed in this and gave us the money to move these materials from California to Brooklyn so that we could all make use of them at City Tech. And so again, this is something once we're in person we can do more with, but I'll talk about the collection at different points during our lectures this semester. Here you can see back in 2017, the African-American gay science fiction writer Samuel R. Delaney, who came to visit us at City Tech and give a talk, is pictured here amongst all the books in the City Tech Science Fiction Collection, which is housed in our library. Being in New York City has also given me some tremendous opportunities, such as this time whenever I spoke with Neil deGrasse Tyson on his radio show Star Talk about the relationship of science fiction and society. It was a really great experience, and this is something else that I'll share with you guys later on this semester. Personally, in my private life, you can see me here with my wife Yufong. She's from Taiwan. And this picture is actually us in front of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. As you'll come to find as we read through Frankenstein, the first novel in our class, Lake Geneva, Switzerland, and a mountain there, Mont Blanc, is going to be very important to the story. And we'll talk more about that. But this was a really great trip to be able to visit Mont Blanc and see the place that Mary Shelley is writing about, and see the place where young Frankenstein, part of his development took place in this area. So, and part of the story takes place there. So that would be really cool when we get to talk about that more in reference to the novel. Yufong and I have a really sweet tuxedo cat who brings us a lot of joy, particularly during the pandemic when we're at home all the time. His name is Mose. He's named after Dwight Schrute's cousin from The Office, because he's very much like Mose. He's very awkward and confused most of the time, and whenever he becomes self-conscious, he runs away. So, it's a fitting name for this particular cat. I'm a lifelong Star Wars fan, as you can see here, pictured at one of my, in my earlier days at my birthday party. I'm rocking my Return of the Jedi Jabba the Hutt t-shirt. Got a Darth Vader birthday cake. So Star Wars has been a lifelong love of mine, which we may talk about later on during the semester. Because of my professional interest in Lego, it actually comes from my personal interest in it. You can see here a model that I built on my own of a small skate park with some vert ramps. I like building with Lego. It helps me think through things in a different way than just simply writing about it or talking about it. But this Lego model that I constructed is related to something else I'm interested in, which is skateboarding culture. Here you can see a reissue of a Mike McGill skateboard by Powell Peralta that I used to have. I've actually sold this and now have a newer board that's an original 1988-1989 Mike McGill that I've tricked out with rails, tailbone, and some new trucks and wheels. Haven't taken it out yet though, but that's something I'll do once we get all this snow cleared. So something that you do want to put in your notes, all the stuff about me I'm not going to test you on obviously, but hopefully that does give you an idea of where I'm coming from, what my background is. But make sure you do put in your notes this information. My email address is jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. I'll always have virtual office hours on Wednesdays from 3 until 5 p.m. I have a link to that for Google Hangouts on our syllabus. And the thing about office hours is I know not everyone can meet during that time, so I'm also available by appointment. All you got to do is send me an email, jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. Let me know what your availability is, when you're free for like a week. That way I can try and find a time in my schedule when we can both meet up online. We can use Google Hangouts, we can use Zoom. If we have to, we can even use the phone. But however we need to work that out, we'll make that happen. When you have questions about the class, questions about school, anything that I can help you with as far as the class is concerned. And then also, I'll mention my blog, dynamicsubspace.net. There's a lot of stuff on there about different science fiction that I've read, that I've discussed, and also other things I'm involved in regarding science fiction. So I think that in itself might be a resource for you. And I'll try to point things out when they might come up where I remember something that's on my blog that might be relevant to our class. But you can also explore it on your own, dynamicsubspace.net. All right, so that's all of that. So I think now we need to turn our attention to the syllabus. So again, have your notebook out as we go over this. And before we actually get into the syllabus, I want to remind you how to join our class on OpenLab to make sure that everybody gets in. I know some folks may be taking the class as an e-permit. If you don't have a official CityTech email address, make sure, and you're coming from another CUNY college, make sure you reach out to me so that I can start the process of getting the OpenLab to create an account for you to join us. But even without an account right now, you will still be able to do all the work in the class because I've made everything completely open in terms of both accessing our OpenLab site as well as commenting for the weekly writing assignments. So many of you are probably familiar with the OpenLab, but if you're not, it's located online at openlab.citytech.cuny.edu. So you want to first navigate there and create an account. And you can create an account using an official CityTech email address, or for those of you that have e-permits, you'll contact me and I'll start the process of getting you an account set up. Once you've got an account, you log in, and as you can see here, I'm already logged in. Welcome, Jason W. Ellis. Got my avatar here. You can upload a picture if you want. You don't have to. And also the thing about OpenLab that you should be aware of is because I run our class in the open according to best practices of open pedagogy, open teaching practices, you don't necessarily have to have your real name displayed. You can edit your profile on OpenLab to use a different name, because on the back end, I'll be able to see your name and email address and always be able to give you credit for the work that you do. But one thing to keep in mind, if you do change like what your screen name or your avatar might look like on here, make sure you always keep it appropriate, because this is something that's also building up your professionalization as a practitioner in whatever career field that you're going into once you graduate from CityTech. So always make sure you keep things appropriate with what name you might use, and not something that may be off color or look inappropriate in another professional's eyes. So once you've got an account, you've logged into OpenLab, I've already sent you an email that gave you a direct link to find our course profile on OpenLab so that you can join it. But I'll show you another way to get to our class, and that's by using the search feature in the upper right hand corner. And in the search box, just type in if I'm on the right keys, ENG2420. And it's going to work for a little bit, and it's going to work and work and work. Probably right now, I imagine a lot of students are just getting on Open Labs, so this may be slower than usual, but we'll try to bear with this. There we go. And now you can see all of the recently added English 2420 science fiction classes that are in Open Lab. As I mentioned in the email, our class has an avatar of Boba Fett and some other characters from Star Wars with these little action figure photo that I took. So look for that avatar and then just double check English 2420 OL74, our section, Spring 2021, taught by Professor Ellis right there. So you know that that's our class. You can see these other avatars are past classes that I've taught, which you're welcome to look at. They're available there, but make sure that you're only joining our section for Spring 2021, because that's where you'll be turning your work. So I will not be looking at these old classes for your work. Make sure you're in the right place. So we're going to click on that for our section. Now, for those of you that haven't joined the class yet, once you click on our profile, right here where on my screen it says Edit Profile, you're going to see a link that says Join Now. And you will click that one time, and that'll add you to our class. And by doing that, you're then going to be able to, whenever you turn in your work on our Open Lab site, it will always give you credit for that, rather than you having to fill out a name and email address every time you submit something. And it also gives you extra privileges for creating posts on our Open Lab site, which is something you'll be doing toward the end of the semester with your research essay, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So once you've joined the class, you will then want to click on Visit Course Site. And that's where all the magic is going to happen for our class this semester, is on the course site. And I also gave you a direct link to this in that first email, but if you want to add this to your bookmarks, you can do so and always go directly there. And if you've been logged out of Open Lab, there will be a login link up here in the upper right hand corner that you can log in to the Open Lab from our course site. So everything will be in this one place. You don't have to worry about going anywhere else for our class. Now, right now, all that I have here is the welcome email that I sent you all already. But this is also here for your reference, so you can review that if you need to. Now, over on the left-hand side, under the avatar, you can see the menu for our class. You'll be able to find announcements, the lectures. Whenever I start collecting your notebooks, I'll post information there under notebooks. Your research essay, I'll tell you how to be doing that later in the semester. The syllabus, we're going to go to in just a minute. And then the weekly writing assignments, you can click that and find out what you need to do for that each week. Now, these things for announcements, lecture, weekly writing are also going to be posted right here in reverse chronological order on the blog for our course site, which means when you first land at our course site, after I've posted today's lecture, you won't see this post at the top. It'll be further down, and what you'll see at the very top will be the lecture. So whenever you go there, you can immediately see what's going on and scroll down and see what the associated assignments are for that week. So everything's going to be here right away, but if you need to review something in the past, use the menu over here on the left to quickly find a lecture, quickly find a weekly writing assignment, etc. And of course, at any point in the time, if you have questions about that, just reach out to me by email or coming to the office hours, and I'll help you out with that. So let's take a look at the syllabus now. And as we begin going through this, if you have any questions, jot them down in your notebook, and that'll be a way to remember to ask me those things via email or during office hours. Okay, so now we're going to be going through the syllabus. So make sure you have your notebooks out, because there may be points that you want to make a note of, even though obviously you can read this again on the website. I think it's useful to make important notes, especially about maybe the assignments and upcoming dates and how to contact me might be the most useful evidence for you to keep in your notebook, so you don't forget those things later on. But the syllabus will always be here on our Open Lab site, so you'll be able to access it later on without a problem. So at the top of the syllabus, which again you can reach by clicking on the syllabus link on the left-hand navigation menu of our course site, at the top is this table of contents, and we're just going to dive right into it. So course information, this is English 2420, section OL74, spring 2021. We're fully online, and we meet online asynchronously. One thing I want to point out about this is that while I know that an asynchronously taught class can be convenient, especially for folks that may have busy schedules, but one thing to keep in mind is that this class actually can be more challenging to most students than a either synchronously taught online class or a normal in-person taught class. The reason being is that there's a lot more need on your part to manage your progress in the class, to maintain engagement in the class, and to simply keep up with the reading and lecturing and assignment schedule. So it's absolutely important that you think now about your own commitment to the class, and that you will use the syllabus, the schedule, and me as a resource to make sure that you're staying on track with the class as we move forward. But one thing to keep in mind, and you see just beneath here my contact information, if at any point you find yourself faltering, falling behind, needing additional help, you reach out to me. You can reach out to me by email, or you can come to my virtual office hours once a week on Wednesdays from 3 to 5 p.m. or by appointment. And I say appointment here because if you can't come during these times, which I understand not everybody can, send me an email letting me know what you want to talk about, and let me know what your availability is for like a week. That way I can try to find a time in my schedule where we both can meet up, whether it be on Google Hangouts, on Zoom, or even by a phone call. Because one way or another we can work that out. But giving me more options makes it quicker for us to establish when we're going to meet, rather than a lot of back and forth emails between one another. Because you have to understand, besides the 3 classes that I'm teaching and preparing the documents for and the lectures for, I also have lots of meetings that go on all the time throughout the week for different things involving school. So the more information you can provide me, the quicker that we can figure out a time to meet, and that's not a problem. And again, my email address, jellis@citytech.cuny.edu, so make sure you remember that. It's a little bit different than student email addresses, just straight at citytech.cuny.edu. So what is this class about? Course description. We will explore the emergence of science fiction, SF abbreviated, capital SF, and examine its preeminence as interdisciplinary literary and artistic forms of pressing cultural importance. To accomplish this, we will read and watch significant examples of SF from its long history, beginning with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and concluding with cyberpunk. Students will have opportunities to demonstrate their learning through note-taking, weekly writing assignments, a research essay, and an essay format final exam. This course is designated as writing intensive, and I've given a link here to exactly what that means, meaning that you're going to be writing a lot in this class. But this is true for all the English 2000 level literature classes. And in essence, you'll see with the assignments and with the weekly writing assignments, the writing is very important, not only for maintaining your engagement in the class and demonstrating your engagement, but also for helping you learn and remember the topics of the class as related to science fiction. And I'll also make a note here, also as a predominantly literature-focused class, it has a demanding reading schedule. And so one of the things I'll point out is that this is a 3-hour class. And with a 3-hour class, obviously we should be meeting for 3 hours. But because there isn't the normal back and forth discussion in this kind of class, normally my lectures are not going to run for a full 3 hours. Some will be longer, some will be shorter. But whatever time is left over, that should be devoted obviously to class type work, the weekly writing assignments, your readings, etc. You can also include time that you might email me or come to my office hours in that. But beyond the 3 hours, the understanding is that you should be spending twice as much time outside of class as what the credit hours are of a class. So for a 3-hour class, that means that you should be spending at least 6 hours outside of class doing the homework. That includes the readings, that includes your note-taking, that includes the weekly writing assignments, and also includes the homework in the class, which is going to be what leads up to your research paper in the class, and then also the take-home final exam that you're going to have at the end of the semester. So you want to budget your time accordingly, and don't think that with this kind of class that you can blow off certain things and expect to get the grade you might want in the class. I'm hoping you all want to get an A, but in order to get the A, you have to put the work in. And if anybody has any questions about that, please reach out, because I'll be happy to talk with you about that. On your own, I'll let you take a look at the learning objectives and prerequisites. I'll open it here in a new tab real quick. But this is what the college agrees upon that all the science fiction English 2420 classes should address in the way that they're taught and what types of assessments are made in the class. And I designed my syllabus with this document in mind. So that's why I give it a link to it here so you can check that out. Required text. Now, one thing about the way that I've designed the class is that ideally you won't have to spend any money on any text, and there's ways around many of the things that you might have to expend money on, such as watching a TV show or a film, which we won't be doing together in the class. But I make allowances for that, and I'll explain that when we get to the tentative schedule. But ideally, you don't have to spend any money on the text. I've selected things that you can find online for free. But of course, if you want to purchase print copies of things, that's perfectly fine. I know some people find it easier to read something that's printed rather than something on a screen. So you can work out which way is best, but I give you links to all of the readings that are in the class. And then you can either make use of those or find your own sources that may be printed or that you find otherwise, like even as ebooks that may be easier for you to read than some of the downloadable scan documents that I link to on archive.org. Some required resources. So obviously you're going to need computer, word processing software, and a means of saving your work securely. Make sure you always save your work securely somewhere very safe, and ideally in multiple places, because if you've been working hard, particularly like on the research essay, which I'm going to give you a lot of time to work on in the class, you don't want to lose any of that and have to redo it, especially when we get close to when that comes due at the end of the semester. You notice here I also mentioned you need to have Dropbox app or similar free software to create PDFs of your class notes. I mentioned Dropbox because through CUNY we have access to Dropbox accounts, or you can just create a free Dropbox account. You get 2 gigs of cloud storage for free that you can use with their app that's available for iOS and for Android. Why I mentioned Dropbox is because it's incredibly easy to use and convenient, not just for storing your files, but for one of the assignments, or 2 of the assignments rather, that I'm going to talk about in a moment, you're going to have to make scanned versions of your handwritten notes. And Dropbox easily allows you to create that by basically opening the Dropbox app on your phone, clicking the plus sign, create scanned PDF, and then you point your camera at each page. So you take a picture of one page, then add another picture for the second page, third page, fourth page, etc. And it outputs as a single PDF file, which you can then share with me via a link or by uploading, which I'll give you instructions for doing later on this semester. So it's an easy, free way that you can do that. That's relatively little hassle. You can Google how to do that. You can ask your friends. I don't think it's incredibly difficult. I wouldn't be asking you to do it if I thought it was impossible. But if you have questions, you can also reach out to me about it. But it is something that there is and understanding that you are you're someone that should be a problem solver. So don't just throw your hands up in the air if you have problems with this. You seek out answers in different places, including me, but also try to figure some things out on your own in order to solve this problem of being able to get your work to me. And I'll be helping you with that, but I just want to throw that out there that we are all in this together, that this is something that you also want to be working towards as much as I'm helping you with it. You need to have access to your CityTech email, obviously, because you need that in order to create an Open Lab account if you don't already have one. I've given you a link here to join the class, and I've already sent that to you via email. And then, of course, a link here to navigate directly to the class site, which is where all the magic happens, as you remember. So grading, probably the most important thing on your mind right now about the class. So first off, you're going to have weekly writing assignments. And what these normally entail are summaries of the readings and viewings in the class. And these are going to amount to 20% of your grade. And these will be things that you turn in on Open Lab. I'll give you directions on how to do that, beginning with this week's first weekly writing assignment, which is due before our lecture next Wednesday. So you have a whole week to work on it. Part of it is going to be an introduction of you to me and your classmates, and part of it will also be about your experience of listening to this lecture and your beginning of the reading of Frankenstein, the first reading in the class. So essentially these weekly writing assignments should be about 1 page double spaced. You can write more. I don't think I'll ever take off for you writing more in this class, but the minimum bar of your writing each week is going to be 250 words that are summarizing the readings and viewings, and if I give you any special instructions about that on Open Lab. The way these work is I'll create a post each week. It'll say weekly writing assignment, comma, week 1, week 2, etc. I'll write down some instructions for you about it, and then you click on the title, which takes you to a separate page for that weekly writing assignment. Scroll to the bottom, and you're going to see a box there for a comment. Now, I don't want you to write your weekly writing assignment in that box. Why, you may ask? Shouldn't you write it in there so that you can post it? What I want you to do with these weekly writing assignments is always write it somewhere else, like in Microsoft Word, Google Docs, Apple Pages, and save that work. Save it on your own hard drive in your cloud storage somewhere else. Then you copy and paste that writing into the comment box and then click post comment at the bottom. That way your work is always safe. And if something happens to Open Lab, because Open Lab could crash, you may lose your internet connection for a time, whatever it might be, I don't want you to lose that writing. So write it someplace safe that you can save it, then copy and paste it into the comment on those assignment posts that I will give you on our Open Lab site. The next 2 big assignments in the class are the midterm class notebook and the final class notebook. And as I mentioned a moment ago, you will use Dropbox or another app if you have one for creating scanned PDFs of your notes. Basically, you use the app to take a photo of each page of your notebook, which is stitched together into a PDF, and then you will give me that PDF either as a shared link, or I may collect them using Dropbox, which may be easier. And I'll give you instructions about how to do that, both for the midterm as well as at the end of the semester. So for the midterm, I'll want to see all your notes up to that point. And then for the final class notebook, just to make sure, from the midterm to the end of the semester. So you won't have to make a bigger notebook to turn it at the end. But if say for example you had fallen behind on the midterm notebook and you get caught back up because you had some time to watch maybe lectures that you missed, do the readings that you missed, add those to the final class notebook and let me know, Professor Ellis, hey, I missed out on some of my notes for the midterm. I got them included in the final class notebook. Can you give me credit for that? I'll be happy to do that, because for me what's more important is you engaging and learning all the material in the class. If that means that you need to get caught up later on, letting me know what's going on allows me to help you do that. But don't do these things just on your own and not telling me about it, because I may not be looking for it. So the important thing is always to keep me in the loop if anything comes up that may cause you to fall behind or jeopardize your success in our class. Now, the last two things that contribute to your grade in the class are the research essay, which is 25%, and the final exam, which is 15%. So for the research essay, you're going to choose your own example of science fiction. It could be a book, a short story, a novella, a comic book, a graphic novel, a video game, even an album would be fine. I'm thinking about Janelle Monáe or Sun Ra, and these different ways that music can be science fictional. You could choose any of these as the topic for your research essay. And your goal with this is to analyze the work that you've selected as an example of science fiction. And what you'll do is you're going to use some research that you do in the library through the databases, which I'll show you later on in the semester. And you'll also use a resource that I'm going to show you in a moment that I'll give you a link to, of a list of cited definitions of science fiction that you can quote from, and I give you the MLA citations, the references, everything you need for you to incorporate into this research essay. And the research essay needs to be between 1,250 words to 1,500 words. It can be longer, but that's the window that you're operating in for the baseline. Obviously, if it's less than that, that's going to impact your grade. But then more than that is totally fine. So you want to try to hit that window, if nothing else. But we'll be talking more about this research essay later on in the semester. Final exam, and this is 15% of your grade. At the very end of the semester, I'm going to give you a take-home essay-based final exam. You're going to be able to use your notes. You can refer to my lectures. Anything and everything relating to the class you'll be able to rely on. But with this final exam, there'll be a finite amount of time left in the semester for you to do this. If you have really good notes, if you followed the Cornell method that I showed you at the beginning of today's lecture, this would be a cakewalk for you to go through, using those handwritten notes to type them into your responses for the final exam. And I'll tell you how you turn that in and everything at the end of the semester. And as I continue going through this, again, if you have any questions, make sure you write them down in your notes, and then you can email me about them later or come to my office hours on Wednesday today when you're seeing this. Okay, attendance policy. So basically, with an attendance policy for an asynchronous class, what I will be looking at is your participation through the exercises that we do on a regular basis in the class. As long as I see that you're engaged in doing the weekly writing assignments and keeping up with the other major assignments, then there's nothing to worry about. You'll have perfect attendance. But where there becomes a problem is if you're not participating, not doing the assignments, and especially for students that may drop off the face of the earth. That's a big problem. I worry about that. But in that case, it could lead to something like a WU or unofficial withdrawal grade, which can not only hurt your performance for the semester, but it can also affect your financial aid. So make sure you're always keeping up with the work, and at any point in time, if something causes you to fall behind, or if you have something come up you have to take care of, you don't have to give me all the details. We are all adults here, but I will trust you if you tell me I cannot do this now, but I can catch up next week, or may I have 2 weeks to finish this project. As long as we have time in the semester, I'm perfectly willing to work with everybody on that. The only problem is at the end of the semester, things have to be done before I turn grades in. So you don't wait to the last minute to tell me something's wrong that's been going wrong for maybe say weeks or months, and then start asking for more time, because then I won't be able to give it at the very end. required format for papers. We're going to be using MLA, which you're probably familiar with from your writing classes. And in particular, I give a link here for the Purdue OWL MLA. I mean, you just do a Google search for these 3 words, Purdue OWL MLA, and it's going to bring you to a page that has been growing over time since I was an undergraduate student. I used this very same resource when I was writing MLA style papers back at Georgia Tech. It's been around for a very long time, but they keep it updated with the most up-to-date style information for MLA. So highly recommend that. There's a lot of other resources online you can use, but that one's my go-to resource that I use myself. Policy for late work. The main thing with late work is if something gets turned in late, you may face like a point penalty on that. But the most important thing is just keep me in the loop if you have to turn something in late before the thing is actually due. So like if you know something is due 2 weeks from now, and you know because you just got your work schedule and you're not going to be able to work on this until the week after next, then email me and say, Professor Ellis, I got this going on. This is why I can't do this right now, but tell me when you can get it done. Let me see that, and then I'll get back to you and we will negotiate, work out a plan to keep you on track. That's the right way to do it. What we don't want to do is where you just don't turn something in and never tell me what's going on, because then there's no way for us to negotiate and figure out how to keep you on track. Because ultimately, I want you all to be successful in the class, but sometimes that involves both of us working together to make that happen. So again, don't hesitate to reach out to me if something's going on that's going to jeopardize your success in our class. With these next 2 statements, I want to read them aloud with you because they're super important. Accessibility statement. City Tech is committed to supporting the educational goals of enrolled students with disabilities in the area of enrollment, academic advisement, tutoring, assistive technologies, and assisting accommodations. If you have or think you may have a disability, you may be eligible for reasonable accommodations or academic adjustments as provided under applicable federal, state, and city laws. You may also request services for temporary conditions or medical issues under certain circumstances. Excuse me. If you have questions about your eligibility or would like to seek accommodation services or academic adjustments, please contact the Center for Student Accessibility at 300 J Street, etc. But here's what's more important for us is this link, where there's an email address and other contact information. So if you have any accessibility issues I need to be made aware of, make sure you reach out to me with those. Also, to let you know, I try to make, by design, our class as accessible as possible online. Your Open Lab has accessibility standards baked into it. I choose a design for our course site that follows accommodation accessibility best practices. I'm not trying in any way to make the course less accessible. I want to make it as accessible as possible for everyone in the class. And if there's some way that the class is lacking or that needs to be adjusted to help you, make sure you let me know, especially in conversation with the Center for Student Accessibility. Now this next one is the college policy on academic integrity. Let me scroll down just a little. There. So students who work with information, ideas, and text owe their audience and sources accuracy and honesty in using, crediting, and citing sources. As a community of intellectual and professional workers, the college recognizes its responsibility for providing instruction and information literacy and academic integrity, offering models of good practice and responding vigilantly and appropriately to infractions of academic integrity. Accordingly, academic dishonesty is prohibited in CUNY and at New York City College of Technology and is punishable by penalties including failing grades, suspension, and expulsion. The complete text of the college policy on academic integrity may be found in the academic catalog here, and I give you a link to that. This is something we'll talk about throughout the semester at different points, but the main idea here is you don't want to commit plagiarism on any of the work that you do in my class. I'm required, if I catch any kind of plagiarism taking place, intentional or not, I have to report it. So what's key, I think, here is to always err on the side of caution. That's why, like with your research paper, I want you to always cite your sources with direct quotes, no paraphrasing. And we'll even talk about like what paraphrasing means later on in the semester. It's not what most students may think it is. And when I say you cite and quote your sources, you put quotation marks around the quotations you want to use and talk about from another text, like say from a story you're reading. And then you'll include a bibliographic entry at the bottom of your work, whether it be like, I think in most cases it's going to always be that research paper we're concerned about this, where you're going to have a works cited section at the end and a bibliographic entry for each text that you're quoting from. And I'll talk a lot about this later on, but I just want to make everybody aware of this policy. There's a college-wide policy, and it's important for us also as being ethical practitioners in academics, and then you later in the workplace, to respect the ideas and writings of others by doing citation. And if you have questions at any point throughout the semester about that, just reach out to me. There's no reason, if there's a question, not to reach out to me about that, because you'll find that I want to answer your questions and help everybody with these types of things in the work that you do together with me in this class. So the last thing in the syllabus is the tentative class schedule. And you can see here that I've written a little bit about what this means for us as an asynchronous class. Because the class meets asynchronously, we will not have a set meeting time for class. Instead, the class lectures and assignments are set according to a weekly schedule on Wednesdays. Below, each class describes what will be covered in the video lecture posted to our Open Lab site on that day, what reading or viewing should be done by the next week, by that Wednesday, and what assignments are due by the next week on Wednesday. And so basically, I tell you what the lecture is about on a given day, and then the things that you need to do beginning that week are what need to be accomplished by the following week. It's important for each student to look at the schedule carefully and plan ahead to stay on track with readings and assignments. And so this is where, again, an asynchronous class is challenging for students that may not be that good at self-monitoring, of setting deadlines for themselves, of setting aside time to work on the class when you're probably used to, as I was as an undergraduate, used to going to class on a certain day, a certain time. Without that structure there, it can be incredibly challenging to keep up in a class like this. So it's something you have to work at if you're not familiar or have never taken an asynchronous class before. And if you need help with more like strategies for that, that's what we can meet together during office hours to talk about. So right now, week 1, Wednesday, February 3rd, meaning that week 1 begins right there, today when you're watching this lecture. Lecture this week, what is science fiction and successful asynchronous class study habits, which I'll talk about toward the end. Then I give you read by next week, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I give you a link to it on the Project Gutenberg's website. Project Gutenberg is a long-term project that's been around for decades now. And what they do is they take public domain texts and make them digitally available for anybody to download and use. So it's an incredible resource for some of the classic texts that are in the public domain, meaning they're not under copyright anymore, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was written originally or published originally in 1818. We're going to be reading the 1831 edition of the text. It has a few minor changes that I'll talk about in lecture later on. But now you click on this link, and that's going to take you to the Project Gutenberg website. And you can see there's links to different formats of the text, so you can click on whichever one's the easiest for you to read. If you just want to read it in a web browser, you can click on Read This Book Online, HTML. If you want to use it like with an e-reader or an EPUB reader, you'd be able to download one of these with images or with no images. If you have a Kindle, you can download the Kindle version with images or no images. There's a text version, and they even have more versions under more files. So one way or another, you will have access to this that you can read for free. You won't have to buy this from a bookstore. And also, one of the benefits is that I can tell you this is exactly the right version that we want to be using in our class, because the earlier editions have slight variation changes. They're not that big a deal, but it can throw some things off in the narrative. So that's what you'll see each week. Read by next week. That means that when you listen to my lecture, after the lecture's over, you need to begin reading whatever it is in preparation for next week's lecture. Then underneath that, you'll see due by next week. And so this will be the assignment that you need to accomplish before next week's lecture. So due by next week, 250 word reply to weekly writing assignment on OpenLab. And so when you see this lecture right now, you can scroll down just a little bit on our OpenLab course site, and you're going to see another post there that's that weekly writing assignment. And I'll give you instructions about what I want you to write for that. And you'll have until Wednesday, February 10th to finish that, to get full credit. And I'll say with these weekly writing assignments, like when I say something's due by next week, just to be honest with you, I normally check those things off during my office hours. So really you have until my office hours of the next week to do that assignment if you want to get full credit on it. So try to keep up with that. And again, if you have trouble with that, email me. So for week 2, lecture this week, I'll begin talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Read for next week, still Frankenstein, and now we're going to be reading chapters 9 through 17. Oh, and let me just back up. Here I say what you're going to be reading in Frankenstein this week. The introduction, the preface, the letters that are at the beginning of the novel, and then chapters 1 through 8. So basically from the very beginning of the document until you get through chapter 8 is what you need to read for this week. Then for next week, you will read chapters 9 through 17. And then we will close out Frankenstein week 3, which will be chapters 18 through 24. So this is how things get broken down. Lecture, what we're going to be doing that week, and then what you need to do for next week, what your reading is, and what the assignment is. Now when we get to week 4, we're going to begin reading shorter works by other science fiction writers. And I should also back up here to say that the way we're approaching science fiction is historically in chronological order. I'm going to be taking you through the history of science fiction, beginning with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And so after Mary Shelley, we're going to be looking at H.G. Wells and E.M. Forster. And each of these are linked to where you can read that particular work. So like if I right click on this H.G. Wells abridged version of the Time Machine, you'll be able to read it on the Project Gutenberg Australia website. And the reason why I chose the abridged version is abridged means shorter. They cut out some things that, while they're great, I would encourage you to read the full version of the Time Machine when you have a chance. But just to get at the heart of the story that's relevant for our discussion, the abridged version is fine. For E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. Right click there. And what's cool about this is a website called the Hathi Trust. And what they do is kind of similar to Project Gutenberg in that they partner with libraries and Google Books to scan out of copyright texts to make them available for people to read. In some cases online, and in others you can download. This is a case where you can read it online. And so this version that you're going to be reading, that the machine stops, is actually a scan of the original 1909 version of this that appeared in the Oxford and Cambridge Review. So you're reading this, even though it's on a screen, you're reading it exactly the same way someone would have read this back in 1909. I think that's pretty cool. And we'll talk more about some of those aspects of the readings as we move through the class. When we get to week 5, here we're getting close to when midterm grades are due. And so for midterm grades, there's really only going to be 2 things that I can look at in order to say what your grade is at that point. One will be your weekly writing assignments. Have you done them all? Have you shown best effort? Will you get all those points? And second will be your midterm notebook. So you can see on week 5, Wednesday, March 3rd, due by next week, will be the midterm notebook. And so you'll need to scan that, and I'll give you instructions beforehand how to do that, and get that to me before the following Wednesday so that I can be able to say whether you have a satisfactory or not satisfactory grade at midterm time. And again, those don't go on your transcripts, just to remind everybody. They're just a way of helping you gauge how you're doing in the class. All right, now we're getting at after midterm, or right at midterm, where we're getting to some of the things in the class that are also visual. They're viewings. And because of the way the class is set up, and because I don't want to make people have to spend money on the class, because I know you're already spending money to take the class. And times are tight right now anyways because of the pandemic and everything else that's going on. So with those things that are available online, I'm giving you direct links to them, such as these Flash Gordon episodes that are available on YouTube to watch. So you'll be able to watch those as like your readings for that particular week. But when we get a little bit further along, so watch by next week here at week 8, right before spring recess, Forbidden Planet is available to watch on archive.org. So that's cool for me to give you a link to. But some things are not freely available, such as when we get to New Wave Science Fiction and Star Trek. So here I do ask at some point, and see the thing is, this is where planning ahead comes in handy, right? Is that later this semester I would really like you to watch this episode of Star Trek, The City on the Edge of Forever. I tell you which season it's in and what episode it is. And this link shows you which different online services are available to stream it, to rent it, to buy it. But what I would encourage you to do is ask around. And you can talk to other students in the class. When you're making comments in our weekly discussions, I'm going to ask that and encourage you to reach out and talk to one another in the class, just like you would when we meet in person, but using our message comment sections on each post as a space where we can do that. So if you can talk to other people that may have access to these things, then certainly that may be a way that multiple folks in the class will be able to watch it when they might not otherwise be able to. But I'll also cover all these things in lecture. So even if, worst case scenario, you can't watch that particular episode, I will discuss it, tell you what it's about, what is the significance of it, etc. Then we get a little bit further down, and same way with this X-Files episode, when we get toward the end of the semester in Cyberpunk, William Gibson wrote this episode of the X-Files called Kill Switch. Season 5, Episode 11. I give you a link to where you can find copies that you can stream, rent, or buy, and also some behind-the-scenes footage that's available for free on YouTube that you can watch. This is something new that I'm trying out, just to be honest with you. So we'll see how it works, and you can let me know how it works as well. So if folks are having real difficulty finding access to these things, let me know. But what I would suggest is start looking now, coordinating now, rather than waiting until week 13, May 5th, to try to find a copy of the X-Files. Because if you use all this lead time, you probably can find a copy somehow to watch. Don't want you doing anything that can get you in trouble illegally, but do talk to people, because you can always borrow things and maybe watch something that way. Or maybe someone can point you to where you might find it online that I'm not aware of. Then you see at the very end of the semester when things are going to be coming due: final notebook, final exam, and 250-word reply to weekly writing assignment due by next week, which would be week 15, May 19th. So everything's going to be coming due that last day of class. And of course I'll have office hours that day too, so if you have questions, last minute problems, you can reach out to me then and I'll be able to help you with that. So we're going to have a very full semester going through the beginnings of science fiction with Mary Shelley, then talking about proto-science fiction, scientific romances, voyage extraordinaires with Jules Verne. We're going to talk about the pulp science fiction era with Hugo Gernsback, then the golden age of science fiction with magazines like Astounding Science Fiction, which still is published out of Manhattan. We're going to then talk about new wave science fiction, feminist science fiction, Afrofuturism, and then finally cyberpunk. So we're going to be going through the historical gamut from when it all began with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein close up to the present. And again, if you have questions about the syllabus, please reach out to me by email or come to my office hours. So let's talk about the next stuff for today's docket, which includes what is science fiction and why should we study it. So for what is science fiction, you see I got some terms here. And I've already mentioned this in the syllabus: SF, capital SF. And you've probably heard other terms like sci-fi, right? You're probably familiar with fantasy. So let's take a look at some definitions of these things. And I'm going to give you a link to this document that I'm about to pull up just underneath today's lecture. So you'll be able to download a copy. I want you to download a copy and save it and use it. Here we go. And I know this is probably too small for you to read on this video screen. That may make it a little bit better. But of course you can download this link underneath our lecture right now and be able to look at it as I'm talking about it in the lecture video. But there's those terms that I want you to kind of just make a notation of in your notes for today's class. Science fiction, abbreviated capital S, capital F, right? No periods, just all together, those two letters, SF. This is the proper name for science fiction. Use this term in our discussions and your writing. Now, this is my working definition of science fiction, and we're going to take a look at a few others that historically are quite important. Narratives based on a techno-scientific turn, meaning that the story depends on that sets it apart from the here and now. Here and now refers to like our present moment, like all the knowledge we have, what's going on historically, socially, everything that's going on around us. It's in the news that we know about our reality. That sets it apart from the here and now, despite its extrapolation from the here and now and its ensuing historical or cultural baggage. The idea here is that a science fictional story is one in which essentially it explores how science and technology affects human beings and society, the individual and society. And it can be done in a lot of different ways. It doesn't always have to be simply something about human beings. It can be an imaginative story about aliens living on an alien world to us. But the thing about science fiction is that it always has to be extrapolated from the writer's here and now, from their historical moment. They can't invent things that aren't known, right? They have to be connected to things that we actually know about. Now, they may imagine what they might be like if we knew more, but if we look at where the story and the story's threads originate, it always has to be about what we actually know. And so this gives us, an incredible lens with science fiction, not necessarily to predict the future, but to learn more about ourselves and about our history. So I know it may sound a little counterintuitive, but this is something we're going to be exploring this semester. Now there's those other terms. I mentioned sci-fi, which you're probably more familiar with. So sci-fi, this is the popular and journalistic term for science fiction. Forrest J. Ackerman is said to have introduced the term as a play on the rising popularity of hi-fi stereos in the 1950s. Sci-fi, hi-fi. Some critics began using sci-fi as a designation of bad science fiction, while reserving the term science fiction, or SF, for the good stuff. The distinction never gained much adoption by journalists or the general public, however. Nevertheless, you will want to know this distinction and use it in our own discussions in the class. So when we talk about science fiction, we're talking about, maybe stories that are of a higher caliber, that are using science and technology in an intelligent way, that aren't making things up that are illogical or don't jive with what we know about science and technology. Whereas things that are more fanciful, fantastic, more made up, don't make sense, from a logical perspective, might be more like the sci-fi stuff. Just as a rule of thumb. But now in popular culture, when you look like in a newspaper, unfortunately, sci-fi is used synonymously, meaning interchangeably, with science fiction. But we, in a science fiction class, are studying science fiction from a different perspective than just simply a journalist that's reporting the news of the day. So there's a couple other terms I give you here that you may or may not have heard of. One is called skiffy, S-K-I-F-F-Y. And this is an alternative pronunciation of sci-fi that gained popularity around 1978 when critics, including Susan Wood, began to promote it as a way to distinguish great science fiction and SF from trashy sci-fi. So skiffy is a derogatory word about bad science fiction. Now, later, a term started gaining some popularity, but is still, I think, used contentiously, and that's speculative fiction. And this is contentiously debated as science fiction. Speculative fiction is part a more respectable term used by some to refer to science fiction, and part near future strongly extrapolated from the present stories. It shares the SF abbreviation. But when we use SF, we're talking science fiction. But just be aware that this term speculative fiction does exist and people do use it. And you might encounter it in some of your research. Now finally, I just want to make you aware of the term fantasy and how it relates to science fiction. So fantasy is not science fiction, and science fiction is not fantasy. So my working definition of fantasy is narratives devoid of the scientific turn, which necessitates the construction of a self-consistent world. So if you want to imagine imaginative made-up stories that don't necessarily use science and technology as the logical basis for what's taking place in the story. So I give some examples here. Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series from 1937, 1954 to 55. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, 97 to 2007. And George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series began 1996 through 2011, and there should be more coming out. When science fiction and fantasy are discussed together, this is important to know, they are sometimes abbreviated as SFF, or the way we would pronounce it is SFNF, meaning science fiction and fantasy. Now, the thing about fantastic works like, say, The Lord of the Rings or Song of Ice and Fire and Harry Potter is that they all contain their own logic to how the world works. It could be that they're a world that includes fantastic creatures like dragons and goblins, right? But we know scientifically that those types of animals don't exist in our evolutionary record. That makes them fantasy. But as others have pointed out, you can have dragons in a science fiction story if you establish on another world that their historical evolutionary record also includes dragons as a part of a natural evolution of its animals to include that. But if we're talking about the Earth, that's just simply not a part of our world. Similarly with magic. Magic is not something that jives with our science. But within a fantastic world, you can create a logic about how magic works, that certain words used in certain ways in conjunction maybe with wands and other magical artifacts allows you to conjure magic, which is all fine and good, but it doesn't jive with science and technology. But that means that it becomes the fantastic. And really where we get into distinctions between good fantasy and bad fantasy is which has the most logical and consistent world. So like you don't necessarily think of, like, say, The Lord of the Rings as having inconsistencies, or the Harry Potter series having inconsistencies. There's a logic to how the magic and the creatures in those worlds operate and relate to one another. But in like if we were to think of like a B movie example of a fantasy story where things work in one instance but don't work in another, or that they're seemingly illogic to the way a magical system works, these would be poor examples of fantasy. So I'm not in any way saying that fantasy is not as good as science fiction. I'm just saying that it's different. And even within fantasy, there are distinctions of good and bad fantasy, just like there's good and bad science fiction. Now, to start things off, and I'll return to this later on, looking at some of these definitions, I would, just to say, like you to read through this list and become familiar with it over the semester, because you will be using it as an important part of your research essay in the class, where you use some of these definitions as a way of testing and evaluating the science fiction you choose for your research paper is an example of science fiction. So the more familiar with what's here will help you later on. So this very first definition of science fiction I give here is from Hugo Gernsback in 1926, and he wrote this in the introduction, the editor's note to the very first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, in April 1926. And he writes, quote, "By scientifiction," that was his word for it. He put it all together. It wasn't yet science fiction. "By scientifiction, I mean the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and Edgar Allan Poe type of story. A charming romance intermingled with scientific fact and prophetic vision. Not only do these amazing tales make tremendously interesting reading, they are always instructive. They supply knowledge in a very palatable form. New adventures pictured for us in the scientifiction of today are not at all impossible of realization tomorrow. Many great science stories destined to be of historical interest are still to be written. Posterity will point to them as having blazed a new trail, not only in literature and fiction, but progress as well." End quote. Gernsback, page 3. So a few things here. First off, you can see that I've given you how to use the quote in MLA format. Quote, quote, and then the parenthetical citation at the end of the sentence. Beneath the quote, I give you the works cited entry for that. Gernsback, Hugo, A New Sort of Magazine, Amazing Stories, date, and the page number. So all the main information is there, though admittedly I'll talk to you about how this needs to be updated to the latest version of MLA. There's been a change in recent years from when I made this a few years ago. But in any event, returning to the content of this particular definition, he basically defines science fiction with these three parts. He says it's a charming romance. And now, romance for Gernsback, the way that word was used back then, meant adventure. It's an adventure story. Intermingled with scientific fact, so that's the second part of his definition. There needs to be science in it, real science. And then the third part is prophetic vision, that it should imagine the world of tomorrow, the inventions of tomorrow. And the reason why Gernsback is taking this kind of approach with science fiction is he himself was an inventor. He owned electrical experimenter magazines. He owned a shop that was doing mail order electrical parts in the early part of the 20th century. His interest in this was building the inventions that would power tomorrow. And he saw science fiction, what he called science fiction, as a way of helping educate and popularize this changing world that he found him and everyone around him in those days. So one thing to consider with all these definitions is we also have to think about them in their historical moment, that there is a certain reason why these particular definitions came about at the particular time by the particular people who thought them up because of their particular historical moment and background. Let's see, what's another good one? This next definition I give you here from J.O. Bailey is from 1947. And this is going to be the last definition that I'm going to leave you with today, because I want to have enough time to just talk about why study SF, and then some of the study things to help you all with, and then talk about the homework. And J.O. Bailey was the first researcher to write a book-length discussion of science fiction. This book here, Pilgrims Through Space and Time, A History and Analysis of Science Fiction. You see, that's 1947, some 21 years after Gernsback. There's already this history of science fiction being developed. And in Bailey's book, he wrote, quote, "A piece of scientific fiction is a narrative of an imaginary invention or discovery in the natural sciences and consequent adventures and experiences. It must be a scientific discovery, something that the author at least rationalizes as possible to science." And so again here, he's connecting science with adventures. He's dropped this idea of didacticism, of teaching, that Gernsback uses, and focuses just on the story elements that involves science and involves this adventure that takes place as a result of the science and what's imagined being possible because of science. But I think these two definitions give us enough to begin our exploration of science fiction. But I would like you to read through these and think about how they apply, and we'll return to some of these during my lectures throughout the semester when we hit some of these historical points. But remember that this is a resource to use throughout the semester, and I'll give you a link to this underneath the lecture on our Open Lab site. So next, why study SF? And so these are some points that you probably should put in your notes, because there'll be things that come up in our discussions throughout the semester. First off, science fiction, kind of counterintuitively, is always about the here and now. It's always about the present. It could be about our present. It is going to be rooted in the present of the author of the science fiction that wrote it, or produced it, if we're talking about like a film, or if we're talking about like a video game or something like that, another media besides written text. And the reason being is that the science fiction story is an extrapolation, meaning you're having a point of initial conditions. When we think about math, about science, you have initial conditions that then set the story off on a trajectory. That trajectory, looking into the future or looking into another world, is the extrapolation. But that extrapolation has to link back to what is known and what is possible to be imagined. And so that we can always surmise something about the here and now, and use science fiction as a way to looking at our present or to looking at the historical past. It also can be veiled commentary and criticism. One of the things we'll talk about later in the semester, particularly about political issues in the past, about how science fiction is a way for people to voice opposition, to voice concerns about what they see happening politically and socially in their particular country or society that they disagree with. But science fiction becomes a veil, like a protective layer that allows them to say these things without it being so obvious that people will attack them for it. And so in a sense, science fiction becomes a safe way of making this commentary or criticism of your here and now. Why study SF? Third point is that it imagines possible worlds. It can be very hopeful. Like if you think about like Afrofuturism, we'll talk about later this semester, one of the big parts of it is imagining a future of Black people, of Black bodies, a place that is hopeful and productive and happy and safe for those people. And we think of like, the biggest example today that we see like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the imagined nation of Wakanda in the Black Panther film, and we saw also in the Avenger films. The idea being that that we can use science fiction to imagine what could be in a positive way, but it can also be used in a negative way to warn us about things. And here we're thinking of things like Brave New World or 1984, where they're showing these dystopian realities. Dystopia is the opposite of a utopia. A utopia is like the good place, a perfect place, whereas a dystopia is like a bad place, the worst place. And so these dystopias allow us to kind of see what might be possible if we don't fix things, if we don't make different choices for ourselves individually or for our society. So these imagined possible worlds is a very powerful aspect, I think, of science fiction. Fourth point, explores the effects of science and technology on human beings, because ultimately all of these stories, even if the story is about aliens or robots and has no human characters, ultimately these stories do explain or provide commentary or ideas about how science and technology ultimately affects human beings, because everything about our world is obviously human-centered. And the things that we create, though, may detract or compromise or challenge that. Science fiction is a place where we can explore some of those things, or some of those challenges, some of those things that are both positive and negative. And then finally, just to mention, science fiction is great about community and fandom. You've probably heard the word fandom before in a lot of other contexts, but originally, the very first fandoms were science fiction fandoms. These were the very first groups. In fact, the first or among the first fandoms were right here in New York City with the Futurians and here in New York City that helped start not just that community of science fiction fans, but that led to the first science fiction convention. Continues today as the World Science Fiction Convention, held in different places all around the world. So there's a tremendous community around these stories of people that are invested in them, that are interested in them, and in different ways. Some are just interested in the stories and enjoying them, being able to talk about them, whereas other of us are interested in analyzing them, of exploring what they mean for our culture. So there's lots of different kinds of community, both academic as well as just fans, that take a part in connecting with others via science fiction. And kind of a final point about that I'll just mention that I think is important. Sadly, this past weekend, I learned that one of my mentors in the field, Kathleen Ann Goonan, pictured here at Georgia Tech, passed away. And it's very sad because obviously, like, she had a lot of students at Georgia Tech. She wasn't a teacher there when I first, wasn't an instructor there when I first met her. She actually came on a visit to the school and invited talk. But she was a part of that science fiction community, not just as an author. She wrote a lot of books on science fiction, but she was also like a member of that community, both as an instructor and as a mentor to me. Because I'll be honest with you, that I'm very fortunate to be able to say that everything about my life right now, and being here in New York City, of being able to create this lecture for you all and to be your instructor in science fiction right now, I have her to thank for. And the reason why is that, if you can imagine, when I was close to finishing my degree at Georgia Tech, 2004, I'd been in school for a very long time at that point, because I'd gone back to work before coming back to finish my degree. And one day I learned from my professor, Lisa Yasik, that she'd invited Kathy Goonan to come give a talk. And before her talk, she would be available on campus just to talk to students in one of the offices. And so I was reading her work to write my own research paper on her novel in a class for Professor Yasik, a gender studies class. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity just to pick her brain a little bit about her writing, about like her ideas, etc. But during that conversation, she turned the camera around, so to speak, and instead of just responding to my questions, she wanted to find out about me. And what I thought would just be a short meeting with her turned into like an all-day conversation. And she was kind enough to give me all that time and talk with me and ask me things about, like, what were my goals, what did I hope to achieve in life, what were my options right now to choose from. Because at that moment in 2004, I had kind of two paths I was already imagining. The most obvious one, that seemed the easiest path, was to pursue a career in IT, doing graphic design, video production, creating web animations. These are things that I had gotten training in at Georgia Tech. But I also had seen people like Professor Yasik, who was my science fiction teacher years before, in I think 2002, and then I was taking her gender studies class then in 2004, who made a career out of teaching science fiction. And I thought, wow, that's so cool, but it seems impossible. How am I going to be able to do that with my life? And through the conversations I had with Kathy Goonan, she helped me see what was possible. She helped me see that path as more than just like a dream, but as a real possibility. And it was because of this community of science fiction, I think, that that I was able to connect with her. But also, you see this person of such generosity and of kindness within the community that you can make a connection with. And science fiction is the thing that brought us together initially. And I think that's pretty cool. And that may be your own experience one day with science fiction, or with some other fandom that you're a part of or that you enjoy. Always look for those opportunities, because you just never know where they might come up and how they may change your life in really amazing ways. So yeah, community, I think, is a big part of science fiction. So, last things though that I do want to address for the class. Okay, so for the last a few minutes of class. I just wanted to share with you some strategies for success that I think just need to be mentioned to remind you about some of the best practices to help you with an asynchronous class like this. And then we'll talk about homework. So again, always take notes, both from the lecture as well as from your readings. So like when you begin reading Frankenstein in your homework, you'll want to make a note of who are some of the main characters you encounter. Where is the action taking place? What is taking place? You don't necessarily have to capture everything, but capture enough detail to help you remember, who is doing things in the story, what is happening, etc. And so make notes both on the lectures each week as well as the readings. And all I'm looking for whenever I grade your notebooks is best effort. I'm not going to go through your notes and try to nickel and dime you on whether you covered one thing versus another. What I want you to do is use this as an opportunity to practice your note taking, because let's say right now you think you're not very good at note taking, that you find it difficult or challenging or a big chore. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. I know from my own personal experience that historically, looking in the past, I was terrible at note taking. I didn't do it regularly, I didn't do it right. And it really reflected in my grades I was getting in my classes. But once I figured out better ways to do it and practiced at it, obviously not only did I become better at note taking, but it also improved my grades. So take notes on the main things in class, and then you use those notes when you're writing your weekly writing assignments as something to jog your memory, to give you something to write about, and then obviously also for the final exam in the class. I recommend also that you return to your notes and rewrite them in a meaningful way to you. You may not have the time to always do this, and you may not necessarily want to do it in my class because this may not be as important to you in terms of other classes that maybe you need to prioritize right now. But one of the best things that ever helped me with note taking and preparing for exams and other classes is that after I had made my notes using the Cornell method, so I got my keywords on one side, my notes on the other, and my summary at the bottom, is I would take those notes maybe at the end of the week on a weekend, and then I would read them, and then I would rewrite them, make them neater, make them legible. Think if there's anything I might have missed. I might leave my textbook open while I'm making those notes, may look up things online, but the idea is to make a perfect copy, a better copy of your notes. Several things go on when you do that. You're going to be recommitting the points in the notes to memory. As I've mentioned before, handwriting is far superior to typing when it comes to making notes that you're actually going to remember. And so if you're handwriting these notes again, it helps you further layer on that meaning. And when I say meaning, it's not just the content that helps your brain remember things. It's that psychomotor control of using your hand to write to help you recommit those things deeply in the way that's meaningful to your memory. I could go on and on about how the human mind works and the way memory works, but it's far more complicated than the way we see it depicted in television and movies, where it's more like a film reel. That's not how it works. It's very experiential, experience-based. So things like, odors, whenever we might be studying, can play a big role in our recall of things. How we feel, whether we're hot or cold. If we're placed back in that same kind of temperature or odor situation, our recall is improved automatically. It's fascinating the way the human mind actually works, but these types of tricks, like using handwriting and handwritten notes to improve our memory of things, if we can do that, why not? Because obviously you need to be learning this material in my class and learning this material in your other classes as well. I also recommend that you keep a day planner. This is one of the things that helped me the most whenever I was in school, and I can imagine it would be very helpful whenever you're in a class that's meeting asynchronously, is to put in your day planner when you need to do things, when things need to be completed, and when those things are completed, you cross them out. And I think a lot of satisfaction comes from crossing things out on a day planner. So you feel not only that you've done it, but you know that you've done it. And so things don't fall through the cracks like an assignment or a deadline that you might otherwise miss. So incredibly useful, very low tech solution to keeping you on track. And then finally, dedicate time to your studies. As I said before, this is a 3-hour class. You need to be spending twice that amount outside of class on the readings, doing research for the research paper, revising your notes, all the things that can improve your success in the class. Use that time for. There'll be times where maybe you don't have that available. There may be times you have more time available. This is where the day planner comes back in, so you can figure out like, well, I actually have a lot of time this weekend. Why don't I go ahead and knock out some of the readings for the next 2 weeks? If you do that, then that saves up time later on that you might have to devote to maybe your job or to your family. So try to be smart with the way you plan you're accomplishing the different tasks in the class. You can read things ahead. I don't want you to think that you can't. You certainly can. The only thing that I have to hold back on are these lectures because I do them sequentially as we move through the semester. But as far as the readings are concerned, if you want to read ahead, go ahead and do so. Just remember to make notes, and then you can slide those notes into the appropriate place in your notebook later on. All right, so finally, let's get to homework. So from the syllabus, you know that you need to begin reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the 1831 edition that I gave you a link to on Project Gutenberg. Again, you can use that digital copy to read from, or you can buy a copy, or maybe you already have a copy, but just make sure it's the 1831 edition and not one of the earlier editions from 1818 or in between. Just because there are some small discrepancies both in plot and also family relations that can skew the story in some surprising ways. And then second, respond to the weekly writing prompt. So just scroll down a little bit underneath the lecture here on OpenLab, and you'll see that there's another post that says weekly writing assignment, comma, week 1. I'll always number them so you know which week we're in. Week 1. And what I'm going to ask you to do is first introduce yourself to me in the class so that other people know like who you are, what your major is, what are maybe some examples of science fiction that you like or that you're interested in. And then also underneath that, I want you to write maybe not the full 250 words, but write a short paragraph about today's lecture. So you can talk a little bit about what stood out to you about the syllabus, what we're going to be doing. You can write a little bit about definitions of science fiction. That would be a really good thing to put. You could also talk about why we study science fiction. So use your notes from the lecture, this last part of the lecture, to inform what you then type up, save on your own computer or on the cloud, that you copy and paste into the comment box on this week's weekly writing assignment. And of course, as we're moving forward, if you got questions, I have office hours from 3 to 5 today and every Wednesday, or you can send me an email. Okay? Email address again is jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. I'm glad you're all here. Stay healthy, be safe, and I will be talking with you all again soon.